I am so happy that Orchid Ninja Bobson asked for a refresher video on how to care for Dendrobium Nobile orchids during the winter. While I feel that I have a video somewhere in my channel library, refresher videos like these are a great time to double check all the variables that we believe we have dialed in. The key word here being believe. I don't know about you, but I have a tendency to operate my collection with tunnel vision sometimes, because why change something if it's working, right? But sometimes the consequences of tunnel vision can include complacency. You miss a single detail, or possibly two, then in spring the light bulb moment hits, and I ask myself the question, how did I not remember that? Or how did I miss that? Or goodness me, I know better than not to have done XYZ, and that ABC is the better of the options anyway. That's just me. However, the fact that you clicked on this video, well, maybe that makes two or however many of us, so thank you for being here. Know that your time and support are greatly appreciated. I will start with one question that can cause the biggest issues, or around which there is a lot of confusion when it comes to Dendrobium nobile species orchids. Now, don't get me wrong, the hybrids can have similar quirks to which all of the following can and possibly will apply, but when it comes to species, we have to be a little bit more aware with following the rules, or else we will miss providing something that they do need and forego any blooms in the spring as a result of missing a certain detail. So let's just say throughout this video, hypothetically, if you care for your Dendrobium nobile complex hybrid the same way as recommended for the species, you cannot go wrong. With one exception, which I will point out, the clue to that exception being the fact that most of our noblies are in fact complex hybrids, and certain attributes that species do not allow for any room for error. Complex nobile hybrids are so much more forgiving and can behave differently because they are complex hybrids. Right, let's get the watering question out of the way. This one can make or break your dendrobium throughout the winter months. Two things can happen if the watering isn't quite up to par. One, withholding water can cause the existing canes to shrivel to the point of no return, no matter how tough we believe dendrobiums as a genus are. And two, the opposite is true if the dendrobium gets too much water because we are attempting to not have the canes shrivel at all. So we still water the orchid and then we get the balance of how much wrong. So from where I am sat, it is always difficult to gauge when it comes to how much water a resting Dendrobium nobile needs, simply because of our environments, they are so different. In general, some say no water whatsoever as from XYZ stage of the orchid's growth, referencing the terminal leaf, meaning the cane has reached maturity, because after the terminal leaf has appeared, the orchid does not absorb moisture as actively and the roots will rot if kept wet for too long. And then you're here and I'm recommending that you please not withhold water from your resting Dendrobium nobiles, as this can be confusing and also it can feel a little daunting, because the next question logically is, how much water is going to actually cause my roots to rot? Will I overdo it even though I'm careful? No matter what your conditions, let me just point you in the direction of, imagine that you are the dew, and all you need to do as your role as the dew in the morning is provide that small amount of water along the surface of the roots or media, that tiny amount of water that dew would provide, no more. Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit, put the brakes on, because I just said every morning. And we know dew will be around every morning if our orchids grow outside. It starts to form in the evening. It sticks around throughout the night, if that is where you have your noblies being outside. Because it is possible your temperatures do not drop below freezing outdoors, then you have next to nothing to do when it comes to watering. Just keep an eye on the canes. If you see them get a little wrinkled, not because of age, but you will notice a little shriveling on older, stronger canes. If your nobile is not getting enough from the daily dew, some of the canes may shrivel, and that is when you intervene, still pretending to be the dew, and give a trickle of water, or if you have a sprayer, then spray the surface of the pot or mount, and that's it. Pretending to be the dew will provide you with the best analogy of how much water you can give your noblies based on your environment. Indoors, however, you may need to be that dew on a daily basis. And if that is the case, you also need to be mindful of what media your nobile is being grown in. Sphagnum moss will retain the moisture from yesterday much longer than fine bark will, and fine bark will retain the moisture much longer than chunky bark will. In the latter two media examples, you may need to hydrate the roots every third or second day respectively. Remember also that a potted nobile will retain more water in a pot than a mounted one, even if the surface of the pot appears to be dry. So let's add another environmental factor into the equation, and that is your humidity levels may be on point, meaning 70% and higher all the time. In that instance, your pot or mount will retain water for longer as well, and the roots of your nobile will draw moisture from the humidity in the air. So as a result of that, as you go around pretending to be the Jew, you may find yourself in the fortunate position to not have to act out your Jew duties for several days, and this way your roots will not rot. Know that during the winter there is a huge margin of grace when it comes to withholding water. If you get it wrong because you are hesitant and concerned that you may end up watering too much, then withholding water for several days after you did your due duty is not going to be detrimental to your nobile. In this case, being the winter, it is true that less is more once again. So if in doubt, wait another day or two and then resume your due duties with just a trickle on the surface of the pot. Now, if you grow your nobiles in a semi-hydroponic setup, please know that your media should never dry out, ever. The roots on nobile orchids in a semi-hydroponic setup are adapted to tolerate damp conditions, and with that, if the pot dries out, that will cause issues. But what you do not want to do is have any residual water in your reservoir. Keep that empty and monitor your wicking material. If your wicking material is damp to the touch, then you're guaranteed that the media in the pot is as well. Once you feel your wicking material is to the point of drying out, then your duties as the Jew will be in form of a single flush, no more. By pouring water through the pot, you have dampened the media again, and with that, back into the mask the pot can go until next time. If you do not have a mask but have the classic drainage holes, then do the same thing. Flush water through the pot and then tilt the pot to drain the reservoir, leaving it empty until the next time due duties call. Of course, the size of the pot will determine how often you will need to flush. You may have noticed that I said the size of the pot and not the size of the orchid. There is a reason for that, because as nobiles rest during the winter, the size of the orchid does not determine how much water it requires. A big nobile is no different than a smaller one. Resting is resting. And if you are concerned about the roots staying damp during colder temperatures, that will cause them to rot, then rest assured, with Dendrobium nobile orchids being somewhat the hardiest of our orchids, the cold, damp roots won't suffer. Contrary to what happens to the root system of our warm-growing orchids. If those roots get exposed to cold temperatures and stay damp, they will struggle, and worst case scenario, they will rot. Now that was a side note, but we are dealing with nobile dendrobiums that are very, very cold tolerant, and with that, their roots behave completely differently if they are cold and damp. But here comes the orchid grower's magic word. But as previously mentioned, I was referring to species nobile dendrobiums because they are what set the pace for the care. However, our nobile complex hybrids from the big box stores or garden centers that are forced to be in bloom this time of year, they need water, they need fertilizer, they cannot be left to dry out. Having been bought new, in full bloom, possibly with a new growth already on the way, your beautiful new nobile hybrid is out of season for a reason. And while that was a quaint little rhyme, it can throw anyone off should you read about or hear about winter resting Dendrobium nobile care. So ignore everything about the watering I just previously mentioned if you have brought a full blooming new nobile home. This time of year meaning fall through winter. They have been forced to bloom at a time of year when they normally would not, because the industry is such that we are drawn to blooming orchids like moths to the light during the winter time. One thing I can say is I am glad one of these beauties has found its forever home with you, because you will have it for a very long time. If you would like to explore what happens next with your nobile hybrid, your new nobile in bloom hybrid, check out the description of this video where I have linked several videos on what you can expect after your nobly charge has stopped blooming. Anywho, one other but comes into the equation because not all our nobly hybrids are new. Some of us have had ours for years, and for that reason, this refresher. So very simply, if your nobly hybrid is in active growth, and yes, they can be in active growth during a time when everybody says stop watering, reduce water, no fertilizer. Well, if your Dendrobium Nobile hybrid is in active growth during the winter months, then I highly recommend that you do not withhold water, that you do not withhold fertilizer. Instead, you follow the orchid's lead and pretend that the season you have outside your cozy home is not happening, because clearly your orchid is doing the opposite of what our supposed current season is, current season being in the northern hemisphere, and that at the time of filming. Now, of course, here come a few questions. Will you forfeit blooms? No, not with complex hybrids. They have been bred to bloom in spring, sí or sí. Translates from Spanish into English, regardless, keeping in context. And then we have another question that's very often asked. Will the orchid produce keikis instead of blooms? Not necessarily, unless there is such a stress factor as withholding water, forcing the orchid to try to save itself because you thought you were doing the right thing and stopped watering, and now the orchid is confused and is fighting for survival, then it may produce keikis. Also, it is said that fertilizing the orchid while it is actively growing and then it produces nubbins, and because it was actively growing in the previous months, that the phenomenon of fertilizing while everything is still at nubbin stage, it can turn the nubbins into keikis as opposed to blooms. Well, I have debunked that with complex hybrids and a species, because throughout the winter of 23 and 24, both my noblies were in active growth throughout the winter for the first time, and I had the best blooming ever. What did happen with my species nobly after the blooming, though, was that it produced keikis for the first time since it arrived on the patio back in 2021. Is that as a result of the fertilizing throughout the winter? It's possible, but none of the nubbins that were growing and then turned into blooms, none of those turned into the keikis. The keikis came afterwards, so I'm not investigating that too much, why it produced keikis, because they only grew after the blooming had finished. And the keikis grew before the big burn, which definitely stressed my species nobly out. So you see, if you follow your orchid's leads, always lean in favor of getting new growths to grow well. All new growths will produce new roots, which in turn will strengthen the orchid, and a strong orchid will bloom better and better and better than one that is struggling. I find that a struggling Dendrobium nobile will produce keikis before it produces blooms, and that is what we want to avoid in case you would like to have your nobly bloom in spring, as she should. Now, it matters not whether your nobly orchids are resting or in active growth. Whatever the circumstances, they need high light. Just because they are resting, that does not mean it is okay to lower the light levels. On the contrary, now is the time to blast them with as much light as they can handle without burning the leaves. Even if you do not supplement with any artificial lights, use the light that you can get naturally and expose them to all of it. Pretend that your noblies are cattleyas during the winter months, and they are going to love you for it. And you will notice leaves turning yellow. Some will drop, but not all should drop. A Dendrobium nobile is not a deciduous orchid. Instead, while they will shed older leaves on older canes sporadically throughout the winter, the leaf drop should be spontaneous. Definitely not all at once. And the leaves should drop from the canes that are at least 2 years old, not from the recent new growth or the canes on which your orchid may currently be blooming, if you got her new. Nobile dendrobiums are not like the deciduous resting dendrobiums as the example of an aphyllum, which is at this stage starting to shed its leaves. No matter which nobile orchid we are growing, it needs to have leaves throughout all the seasons. Loss of all the leaves is not a sign of getting the winter resting care right. And know that the leaf drop, being sporadic, will continue into early spring. One leaf here, one leaf there. There's no rhyme or reason, just here and there, one or two will go. Now, I just recently took off 3 leaves that died back on my complex hybrid. that is because they were heavily sunburnt during the summer, so that was because of the result of wrong culture back in the day. 3 leaves within a single week? That's a lot. That is how slow these orchids are to drop their leaves. I hope that little bit of information helped you to gauge when you see leaves drop, how quickly they drop, whether your orchid is behaving normally. Now, if you would give me a moment to circle back on what I briefly touched upon earlier, temperature, and while I cover that for species and complex hybrids, I would so appreciate a thumbs up as well as a vote of confidence by subscribing to my channel if you have not already done so. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Right, last but not least, temperature. Now, all nobly complex hybrids can tolerate temperatures as low as 5 degrees Celsius. Some even lower, but I will only speak on these lows because that is what mine have to deal with outside, and I have never seen cold burn on any of the structures or cells collapsing, causing canes to turn into mush. When it comes to species orchids, as you can see, my Cooksonianum is doing great, and she too tolerates temperatures that low. However, should you have a species nobly and are not sure if yours can go that low without risking damage, then please feel free to ask about your specific case in the comments. I would be happy to be a second set of brain cells to give you peace of mind when it comes to the one you have questions about. If you are hesitant to go as low as 5 degrees Celsius, or you don't have any space that you can place your noblies in order for them to be exposed to that cold temperature, again, referring to species because the complex hybrids do not need those low temperatures to perform. It's just convenient that they do. Then at least getting the species down to a temperature of 10 degrees Celsius is sufficient. And that could mean you need to move your orchid to the garage or elsewhere where it can get some cold exposure, because species nobiles will need a temperature drop based on their DNA, and that is what pushes them to flower. So just make sure though, if you have to move your orchid, that you do not forget it also needs high light regardless of where it has the low temperature exposure. People have asked me many times as well, for how long? That is environmental based. In my climate here in southern Spain, I have those kind of low temperatures starting mid-December all the way through, sometimes, I hate to admit it, mid-March. So in my case, that's 3 months. It's also the time where the daylight starts to increase. So you see how that works together. More light, lower temperatures, and bit by bit the orchid starts to wake up and starts producing nubbins. If you are in an area where your light levels don't increase by February or March, and you do not supplement with artificial light, then it may take until April. But at least give your nobiles a temperature drop of 6 weeks. I would prefer to say 2 months at a bare minimum. And don't forget the water. You are the dew. So I hope that I've done justice to Orchid Ninja Bob's sun refresher request. If I missed something that you would like to add in the comments, anyone that watches this video included, please do not hesitate to add that into the comments as well. We can all learn from every experience anyone would like to share with us. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching. I wish you the most wonderful of days, on the condition though, please, that you stay safe. Take care. Bye.